If you got a Bible with you, Exodus chapter 13 is where we are going to be this morning. If you don't have a Bible with you, we'll have all the verses on the screens right here, and you can follow along with us there. Real quick, let me just mention to kind of maybe put your minds at ease if you notice stuff. So for in here in the sanctuary, obviously we're back in here. We still have a punch list with our contractor, so like the 1,000 little details and touch-up that you noticed, you don't need to email us, okay? We are aware all that would be done. A couple months from now, if you see stuff, then email us, but there's still stuff being done, so just want to let you know about that. So I believe that there are two kinds of people in the world, ultimately, at the end of the day. The first kind of person is the person who, on a trip, their mission is to get from point A to point B as quickly and efficiently as possible. Okay, how many of you, that's you? If you're going somewhere, it's not about stopping, it's not about seeing things, like you want to get there and get it done. And there's that type of person. The other type of the person is a person who on a trip, they want to stop everywhere. They want to see all of the sights. They want to just experience everything and have this like grand old time. How many of you are that person? Okay, here's the crazy thing. Typically, those two people end up marrying each other, right? How many of you is that true for? Like you're one way and your spouse is the other. So Christy, my wife, she's the kind where she wants to stop everywhere and see everything and have all this fun. And unfortunately, she's converted my kids to her side as well. So especially like now being here in Texas, if we go anywhere, we've got to stop at like every Buc-ee's. We've got to walk around for 30 minutes, like spend my entire savings account like on candy and all this stuff. We just want to do everything. It drives me crazy. Because I'm the kind of person, if it's up to me, I'm like, all right, kids, we're packing a lunch. I'm going to toss you some empty Gatorade bottles in the back. If you have to go to the bathroom, like we are not stopping. We are getting to where we're going. That's how I am. That's kind of how I am wired. Now, because of that, this story we're looking at today gives me so much angst and so much anxiety. Because the story today, we're going to look at the Israelites. What's happened is they have just been freed from generations of slavery to Egypt, the oppressive empire. They have just been freed from slavery to Egypt, and they begin a journey out of Egypt toward their new home, toward the promised land that God had promised to give them. But as you read the story about their journey, what we learn is that what should have taken them about 11 days ends up taking them 40 years. Right? It should have been an 11-day trip. It ends up taking them 40 years. And so I read that, I'm like, guys, you're blowing it here. Like there is so much more efficient way to do this, to make this journey. But as we're going to read, as we're going to dig in, and as you really look at the whole Exodus story, what we learn is that the reason that this 11-day journey ended up taking 40 years, it wasn't because they were just, making too many bathroom stops along the way. The reason is because God was intentionally delaying their journey because during that time, God was doing something in them. They needed that time of 40 years for God to form them into the people that He was calling them to be before they moved into their new home. God took them the long way, but what we're going to see this morning is that God had a purpose in it. Now, if you're wondering why we're kind of looking at that as a church this morning, it's because I think that there are so many different ways that we could point out and talk about that. As a church, there's so many ways where it feels like God has kind of brought us the long way, right? Like, so you think about, for instance, the last time that we met and gathered here in the sanctuary was last August. Last August, the AC went out, and we said, okay, well, we're going to be out of the sanctuary for a few weeks anyway, so we might as well start and go do some renovations while we're out. And what we thought last August was, or what I at least naively thought last August was, hey, great, we're going out in August, we'll be back in plenty of time for Christmas Eve. Right, and Christmas Eve is going to be a great time of celebration. We'll open our doors. We'll invite the community in. There'll be a huge crowd. It'll just be a great time to celebrate the incarnation together in our sanctuary. And then we started hearing three little words that I never want to hear in my life again: supply chain issues. And then Christmas Eve came and went, and we weren't in here. And then we said, okay, well, mid-February, that's our new target. Certainly by mid-February, we'll be in the sanctuary. And February came and went, and we weren't in here. And then mid-February, like, hey, you know what? At least there's plenty of time between now and Easter. We're absolutely 1,000% going to be in the sanctuary by Easter. And so as a church, we had a lot of great ideas. We had a lot of great outreach things we were going to do to serve and bless the community, to invite the community here on Easter. And we were excited. It was just going to be a great time of celebrating the resurrection together here in the sanctuary. And Easter came and went, and we weren't in here. And finally now, ironically today, Memorial Day weekend, one of the lowest attended Sundays typically on the church calendar, we are finally back in the sanctuary. Right? And so it seems like with this whole process, what should have been and could have been a little quicker, it seems like God took us the long way. And another area, if you've been here a while, when Pastor Jim retired about 4 years ago, the church went about 4 years without having a permanent senior pastor. Now, I know that I'm not telling you any breaking news when I say that typically it doesn't take a church 4 years to find a senior pastor, right? But for some reason, it seems like here for us as a church, God brought us the long way. And so as a church family, right, if you are here and you're part of the family, then you understand that what we are all about, our mission, our vision, we are all about reaching our community with the good news of the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? It's to accomplish the Great Commission where Jesus says, go and make disciples. That's what we are all about. The way we kind of put that here is we say we are a family inviting others into the life-giving story of Jesus. So that's who we are. That's what we want to be about. Everything kind of goes toward that. But again, there's so many things that have happened that it feels like it's taken us so long to get to the place where we are ready and able and prepared to do that. It feels like God has taken us the long way. And so I want us to look at this story this morning to encourage us and to remind us that in that time, nothing has been lost, that disappointments and delays and detours are never the end of the story, and that in all of that, God has a plan and He has been working all along. So in Exodus 13, I'll kind of set it up real quick. What's going on is we're going to be looking at the story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. But instead of looking at just kind of the details of them actually crossing the Red Sea, I want us to focus in on what led up to that moment, what led to them crossing the Red Sea. And so if you're new to church, new to the Bible, what happened before this, as I mentioned earlier, but the Israelites, they had been enslaved in Egypt for generations. For hundreds of years, they were being oppressed by the Egyptian empire. But finally, after generations of slavery, God raises up this man named Moses. Moses comes in, he confronts Pharaoh, and through God doing miracles through Moses, Pharaoh finally agrees to release the Israelites. He lets them free. So they leave Egypt and they head toward the promised land, their new home. But as they're headed to the promised land, they get stopped on the shore of the Red Sea, this massive body of water. And so they're camped out there at the shore of the sea trying to figure out the plan. Like, are they going to take all the time to go around? They can't go over. They can't go under. What are they going to do? But as they're there trying to figure it out, Pharaoh has a change of heart. Pharaoh starts regretting the fact that he let them go in the first place. So Pharaoh gathers up some troops. He gets some of his armies together, and he goes and he begins pursuing the Israelites. He says, I'm going to go, I'm going to recapture them, I'm going to bring as many of them as I can back to Egypt as slaves, and the rest of them that we can't carry back, I'm going to slaughter them and leave their bodies there in the desert. And so Pharaoh begins this pursuit, and as they get there, the people of God, the Israelites, they have this massive body of water on one side of them, and they've got the Egyptian army charging after them on the other side. It seems on the surface like they are completely hopeless and they are trapped with no hope for deliverance. But when they are out of hope, that's exactly when God delivers them. God sends a wind to miraculously part the waters of the sea so that they can walk across on dry ground. So the Israelites, they walk across, and of course the Egyptians chase after them. The Egyptians begin going across the sea. But when the Israelites get to the other side, God stops the wind and the waters come back together and drowns the army of Pharaoh in the sea. And so that's what happens. That's the context. But I want to rewind a little bit and look at what sets that up. So Exodus chapter 13. It says, when Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road, that runs through Philistine territory. Isn't that interesting? It says when Pharaoh finally let them go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest distance to the promised land. God did not lead them the way that was the shortest distance. And then if you jump to verse 18, it says, so God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. So this is fascinating that the text makes it clear that there was a much easier way to get from Egypt to the promised land. There's a much quicker way. But God doesn't lead his people that way. He takes them the long way. And not only does he take them the long way, he takes them a long way that leads them to being trapped between a sea and an army. Now, what we're going to see in a moment is that God wasn't doing this because he's cruel. God wasn't doing this because he just wanted a good laugh at the expense of his people. He had a plan and he had a purpose in doing this all along. Let me read the rest of verse 17. It says, when Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. And look at this. It says, God said, if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. God says, if I allow them to go the easy way, if I allow them to take the shortest route, then they may be faced with a battle and they will be afraid. They won't believe and trust that I will fight for them, that I will care for them, that I will take care of them. They will never have the confidence that I am with them. See, the short route from Egypt to the Promised Land, it was littered all throughout with small Egyptian military outposts. And so what God is saying is, if they go that route, they're going to come face to face with these Egyptian military outposts. They're going to be afraid. They're not going to be willing to fight. They will surrender, and they will be taken back to Egypt as slaves. God says, I'm not going to lead them the quickest way because the quickest way isn't good for them. But then as it goes on in verse 14, the text gives us even more insight into what God was doing here. So it goes on, 14 verse 1. It says, then the Lord gave these instructions. Order the Israelites to turn back and camp by Pi Hahiroth, or something like that. It says, between Migdol and the sea. Camp there along the shore, across from Baal-Zephon. Then Pharaoh will think the Israelites are confused. They are trapped in the wilderness, and once again I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after you. And listen, here's the key to this whole thing. God says, I have planned this in order to what? Read it with me. I have planned this in order to display my glory. All right, y'all aren't listening very well this morning. Read it with me. I have planned this in order to display my glory, what God says, through Pharaoh and his whole army. After this, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites camped there as they were told. God says, I'm going to lead you the long way. I'm going to take you the long way. I'm going to lead you to the Red Sea, and on the surface, it's going to look like you are trapped there. Because Pharaoh is going to come, and Pharaoh is going to pursue you, and it looks like there's not going to be any way out, but I'm doing this so that I will display my glory through destroying Pharaoh. God says, I'm going to display my glory to the world by miraculously destroying the most powerful military force on the entire earth. And through that, you will know forevermore that I am your God, and that I am with you, and that I have your back, and that I will always fight for you. And you will then know that you don't need to be afraid, and you never have to return to your chains in Egypt. So when God is taking his people on this journey again, he doesn't take them the easy way. He doesn't take them the route that would be the quickest time. He takes them the long way. But again, we see that God clearly had a plan, and he clearly had a purpose the entire time. So here's kind of the big idea. If you're taking notes, write this down. The big idea that we learn from this is that God is always doing more than we can see in the moment. All right, in your life, in my life, in the world, in our church, God is always doing 1,000,000 times more than we can ever see in the moment. See, if you were to ask the people of God as they were leaving Egypt and headed to the Promised Land, like all they could see on the surface was that God was taking them from point A to point B. If you ask them, hey, why is God taking you this route? Why is he sending you in this direction? All they could see at first, well, he's taking us to the Promised Land. But beneath the surface, what they could not see was that God was doing so much more than just taking them from point A to point B. God was getting ready to display His glory to them so that, again, as I said, they would never have to live in fear of their enemies again. See, if God didn't do this, if He didn't prove Himself faithful to them, if He would have kind of just made it easy for them and gotten them to the promised land in a few days without any opposition, here's what would have happened. The people of God would have arrived in the promised land, and for the rest of their lives, think about this because you and I would too, the rest of their lives, they would have spent every day with an underlying sense of fear and anxiety that at any moment, Pharaoh would change his mind and come to get them. They would live with that fear every day the rest of their lives. But God takes them the long way to display His glory to them so clearly so that they will know that they never have to be afraid. God was doing something that they could not see on the surface. And so listen, I will almost be willing to guarantee you there are going to be times in your life, in my life again, in the life of our church, where it feels like God is taking you the long way, right? Where it feels like you're on a detour. You're like, man, I didn't expect it to be like this. But the thing that we can have confidence in is that in those moments, God is doing so much more than you and I can see. It may not feel like it. It may be hard to believe it. But God is always doing more than we can see. It's kind of like if you've raised kids and have a baby, it's kind of like when you take your baby to the doctor to get shots. Right now, all 4 of our kids, when they were babies, they didn't like me at all. They only wanted Christy. Right? And so if I'm holding them and they're crying, she would take them immediately. They stop crying. And she would try to comfort me by saying, oh, it's because I feed them and they were in my womb for 9 months. That's why. But eventually I got smart and I realized why my kids hated me as babies. And it's because any time that they had to go to the doctor and get their shots, Christy all of a sudden had some really important meeting at work that she could not reschedule, and I would have to take them. And so when my kids were babies, all they saw me as was this creepy guy who held them down at the doctor's office while a stranger shoves needles into their legs. That's all they knew me as babies. But think about a baby getting their shots. Think about that from their perspective. Right? When they are there getting those shots, they have no idea what's going on, do they? They have no idea. All they can see is they look up and they see their dad who is supposed to care for them and supposed to protect them. They see their dad allowing them to get things poked into their legs that hurt. All they can see in the moment is their dad is letting them go through pain. What they can't see or understand or comprehend as infants is that, yes, I am letting them go through a temporary moment of pain, but it is so that they will not get polio and end up in a wheelchair for the rest of their lives. Right? Yes, as a father, I will let them bleed and hurt for a moment, but it's because I'm protecting them from something so much worse that they can't see. And oftentimes we just got to realize that there are times where it's the same with us and God. Right? Where God may allow us to walk through things that in the moment, it's just like, God, what are you doing here? God, why would you let me go through this? God, what is your plan? What is your purpose in all this? Because it doesn't seem like there is one. Again, God is always doing a million times more things than we can see or understand in the moment. I'll give you an example from our life. Back when Christy and I, when we first decided that we wanted to start trying to have kids, Christy got pregnant the first month that we started trying. It was absolutely crazy, right? She got pregnant immediately, right away. And then about 10 weeks into the pregnancy, we had a miscarriage and lost the baby. Right? So we were just absolutely shattered, absolutely heartbroken through that process. But kind of the one thing in those difficult moments, the one hope that we held on to was, like we said, well, at least we were able to get pregnant right away, so we'll get pregnant right away again, and this thing will move along. That's what we thought. And then so we tried, and we tried, and we tried. And it took over a year to get pregnant again. And again, in that time of waiting, it's just like, God, what are you doing here? Like, why would you make us wait for this? It doesn't seem like there's a plan. It doesn't seem like there is a purpose in any of that. Like, I couldn't comprehend that God was doing something. And looking back on it now, I can clearly see at least one of the reasons of what God was doing and making us wait. Because now, almost 5 years ago, we began fostering our now daughter, Aria. And so when we heard about the situation and that she needed a home, by that point we were at a stage of life where we had 2 kids, one of them, Azariah, being her exact same age. And having 2 kids, we had the capacity, we had the resources, we had the space in our home to take in a 3rd child. We had the ability to do that, so we said, okay, we will do that, we will take her in. And what I realize now is that after that miscarriage, if we would have gotten pregnant immediately and had our 1st kid sooner, and then we would have had our 2nd kid sooner, then by the time we heard about Aria, we would have already been trying for our 3rd kid. And at that point, we wouldn't have had the capacity to take on a 4th. We wouldn't have had the resources. We wouldn't have had the space or the margin to take another child into our home. If things had gone according to my timeline and my plan, we would have said no and wouldn't have been able to foster Aria. And I wouldn't have her as a daughter today. See, but in that season of waiting, I couldn't see that plan. I couldn't see that God was still active. I couldn't see that God was doing something. God is always doing so much more than we can see in the moment or understand. And so listen, let me just encourage us. When we don't know what's going on, when hope feels lost, when plans are delayed, we can trust God. We can trust God that He is good and that He is always up to something. Let me show you as the story closes just such a beautiful reason why we can trust God. As the Egyptian army, they start closing in on the Israelites who are standing at the shore of the sea. And this is what it says in chapter 14, verse 10. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up and they panicked when they saw the Egyptians overtaking them. They cried out to the Lord and they said to Moses, listen to this. They said, why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave Egypt? Didn't we tell you this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, leave us alone. Let us be slaves in Egypt. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than be a corpse in the wilderness. Do you see what's happening here? Literally hours ago. Like this isn't several years later. Hours ago. God has miraculously freed them from slavery. He has given these miraculous 10 plagues to show His power to set them free. That happened hours ago. And already they're doubting. Already they are frantic. Already they're saying, God, you don't care about us. You're just going to let us die here in the desert. And listen, if I was God, I would have let them. It's like after all I've just done for you. After all 10 plagues, all this, I set you free. After all that, you're going to doubt me. That's how I would respond if I'm God. But look at what it says in verse 13. It says, but Moses told the people, don't be afraid. Just stand still. I love that. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today will never be seen again. The Lord Himself will fight for you. Just stay calm. So here's what we see here. Here is why we can trust God even when we can't see what He's doing. It's because God's faithfulness to us is not determined by our faithfulness to Him. That's such good news. God's faithfulness to us is not determined by our faithfulness to Him. The people here, they have every reason to trust God. God has just moved mountains to rescue them. They should trust God. They should be faithful. But their level of faithfulness on a scale of like 1 to 10 is like a negative 10. They are not faithful at all. But even still, we see that God shows up and fights for them. And isn't that such good news? that God's faithfulness to us is not determined by our faithfulness to Him. Because for me, most days I'm more unfaithful than I am faithful. Most days I get more things wrong than I get right. Most days I don't follow Him like I should. I have so far to go in my relationship with God, and still, in spite of that, God is faithful to me. Well, that's good news. And so listen, let's just think about this as a church for a moment. Again, I know there's been seasons. I know there's been challenging times. I know there's been times here as a church where it's like, hey, God, like, are you still here? Are you around, or did you kind of check out a while ago? It may seem like God hasn't been working, that God hasn't been moving, that God has not been up to something. But again, God is always doing so much more than we can see in the moment. And as a church, listen, here's the deal. Do we deserve God to still work among us? I don't know, maybe not, though. Do we deserve God's faithfulness as a church? Probably not. Do we deserve for God to turn this place around to be a place of hope and healing and a lighthouse to our community? Probably not. But again, the good news, His faithfulness to us is not determined by our faithfulness to Him. He is faithful even when we are not. And for you personally in your life, if you're walking through just a difficult season, if you're walking through somewhere where you're looking like, God, I'm not sure what you're doing, like what's going on? Like I'm praying and I don't see the answers. Again, listen, don't hear me wrong, because I'm not promising you that you may see the answers here on this side of eternity, because you may not. And I know that's hard. I know that's difficult. I know that's challenging. But you will see the answer one day, either in this life or the next. That 10 billion years from now, when we are with God in His kingdom, we will look back on this life and we will be able to see it all unfold and say, oh, He was at work. He was doing something. He was doing so many things that I could not see in the moment. And you can trust that. You can believe that. You can hope in that. Because again, His faithfulness to us is not dependent on our faithfulness to Him. And here's the greatest proof of that at all. If you ever doubt either of those two things, that God's always doing more than we can see, or that His faithfulness to us is not dependent on our faithfulness to Him, if you ever doubt either of those two things, all you need to do is look to the cross. If you ever begin to struggle, if you ever begin to wrestle, if you ever begin to doubt either of those, just fix your eyes on the cross, because on the cross we see the truth and beauty of both of those things. First, on the cross, we see that it's true that His faithfulness to us is not determined by our faithfulness to Him. Because on the cross, Jesus is dying for His enemies. Right? He is dying for us sinners who have rejected Him. Right? The Bible says that while we were still sinners, meaning while we are still unfaithful, the Word says, that's when He died for us. The cross is God showing unfailing love to people who are not faithful to Him at all. And on the cross, we see the truth that God was doing so much more than could ever be imagined in that moment. Because in that moment on the cross, it seemed like all hope was lost. When Jesus said, "It is finished," and breathed His last breath and hung His head, to anybody watching there that day, all it would have looked like was, here is another poor, helpless man who has been executed by the great Roman Empire. That's all that it looked like on the surface. But again, God was doing so much more than anyone could see on the surface. Because on the third day, Jesus' eyes opened. His lungs filled with air. His dead heart began to beat again. And He would walk out of the grave, putting death to death. Because God was doing so much more than anybody could ever see or imagine in that moment. Will you pray with me?